to start? Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our first Kavli Conversation on Science Communication of the 2018-19 academic year. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of journalism here at NYU, the Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU. And I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And I am very excited about what we are up to today. We're going to be talking about an interesting and important topic, and that is the black market wildlife trade and what can be done. How do we sort of break this cycle that seems so difficult to get out of? We have two wonderful guests. Dr. Timothy Tier is here from the Wildlife Conservation Society. He's the director of their Africa program. Lee will formally introduce him, but I just want to say thank you very much, Tim, for coming. And just forgive me for a minute if I just say a few words about our second guest. She is Rachel Nuwer, and when I first met Rachel in, what year was it, Rachel?
2010.
2010 or so. She told me she really wanted to come to this science journalism program that I run, and she said she was really interested in the wildlife trade, and she said someday she would love to write a book about it. And I tell you, it is just such a wonderful feeling for me, just to Kvel, as my grandmother would say, in Rachel's success. If you saw the Science Times today, you saw that Rachel has the cover of the Science Times with an excerpt from her new book. And here's her new book, America and the World. And you should buy it. You can buy it right here in the room, or you can buy it in your local neighborhood store, or you can buy it online. But for God's sakes, buy it. I feel like I had a kind of a Yenta role in the production of this book, and I couldn't be happier now that it's a real thing. So Rachel, congratulations, and I am just incredibly proud of you.
Thanks, Dan.
And with that, yeah, it's just really, it's special for me. And finally, I just want to thank Robert Lee Holtz for, it's got to be at least the 10th year that we've been doing these, right? Have I got that right?
12.
Oh my God, it's the 12th year that Lee has been hosting this series. First we called it Inside Out, now we call it the Kavli Conversations. We're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation for giving us the funding we need to do this. Lee is a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute. He's a science writer at the Wall Street Journal, and he's a fantastic guy. And we're very grateful to Lee for putting up with this and doing this now for a dozen years. So thank you, Lee, and with that, take it away.
Well, and thank you, Dan. Truly, thank you very much. And thank you to the Kavli Foundation, which sponsors this series. So we're here tonight to explore how the story of science gets to the general public, how it gets there through the work of science journalists, and how it gets there through the work of scientists who themselves have a passion for communications. Now, I want to just take a second and give you a look ahead at what we've got in line for this fall. On October 9th, we'll be joined by one of the world's most well-known science writers, Carl Zimmer, and University of Kansas anthropologist Jennifer Raff to talk about Carl's new book and to explore the challenges of covering the conundrums of human heredity. On November 15th, we're very excited about this, we're going to have a special screening of a new and quite remarkable science documentary called The Most Unknown. And we'll have filmmaker Ian Cheney and one of the featured researchers, Penn State geoscientist Jennifer McLady, will be talking with us. And we'll conclude on December 6th with something of a food fight. We will be talking about the disputed science of nutrition, one of the most important things in our culture, and one of the things that is just an endless source of technical and scientific controversies, with two leaders in the coverage of nutrition, noted author Paul Greenberg and the renowned NYU food studies professor Marion Nessel. All of our webcasts, all of our conversations are webcast, as Dan noted. And I should say that those of you who are watching us online tonight can participate. You can tweet any question you might have using the hashtag Kavli Convo. And you here can join us by speaking up. But please, I ask you to use the microphone so that those who are online can hear what you're asking. Your questions are part of what makes this work. So look, tonight we're here to explore a troubling trend and the challenges that it poses for journalists and for conservation biology activists, and I mean the growing trade in endangered wildlife. I mean, consider the poacher's price list. Rhino horn is literally worth more than its weight in gold. Tiger penis soup goes in some parts of China for $300 a bowl. The scales of the pangolin, a much-loved scaly anteater that's found in Asia and Africa, they sell for about $350 a pound. And as a consequence, over 1 million pangolins have been killed for market in the last 10 years. It adds up to a business worth about, depending on who you ask, between $19 billion and $23 billion a year, and that rivals, in terms of profitability, drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and trafficking in human women. So, on that unsettling note, let me welcome Rachel and Timothy to our podium. And it is her coverage of the illegal wildlife trade that brings us here together tonight. And of course, if I may lean across, as Dan has noted, her coverage and of course this, Poached, which I'm happy to say today is officially and formally published. She is the author of this remarkable book, and she is an award-winning freelance science journalist who writes on topics ranging from purloined pythons to the most famous dead body on Mount Everest for National Geographic, the BBC, the New York Times, among others, whereas again, Dan noted, she's very easy to find today on the front page of the Times Science section. Timothy joins us most recently from Mozambique, which he's just returned from. He is executive director of the WCS Africa program, the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is based here in New York. And that, for those of you who don't know, that's the largest and longest standing field conservation program on the continent, committed to conserving wildlife and wild places. And Tim has been working in conservation for over 30 years, and I won't have time to list all the places that he's hung his hat and tried to make things better. Eastern Africa, Kenya, Southern Sudan, Arabia, Tanzania, Serengeti National Park. And his publications as a scientist include identifying conservation priorities for Africa, using a return on investment approach, using the multiplier effect to assess the impact of tourism investments in Tanzania, improving resource management in the face of climate change, and setting objectives in conservation, evaluating the impacts of air pollution on biological diversity. So I want to start this way by asking you, Rachel, if you can tell us what currently is the world's most trafficked mammal.
This is my favorite animal to talk about, the pangolin. The pangolin is the world's only scaled mammal. There are 8 species, 4 in Asia, including India, and 4 in Africa. And nobody really knew about pangolins when I first became interested in them. I traveled to Vietnam to do some research, and I heard about these weird creatures called pangolins. Cool fact, a pangolin's tongue can be as long as its body. It goes all the way down here. So, like, imagine that. And that's because it loves to eat ants and termites. So it uses that tongue to, like, stick into little nooks in trees and mounds and things like that. Pangolins are super shy. They're nocturnal. If you grab a pangolin, it's not going to scream at you or bite you. It's going to curl up into a little ball, which is really useful against, say, for example, lions, but not against people. There's very... Go ahead.
So people are buying and selling it because it's cute?
Well, it's in Southeast Asia, in China, in fact, wherever pangolins are found throughout its range, in Africa as well. Because it looks so weird, people are attracted to the scaly mammal, and they think that the scales have interesting properties. In Asia, for example, some people believe it can help a woman lactate who's having issues with her breast milk. And people catch it, and they scale it, and they eat its meat, and they think they're going to get some great properties from this. And the problem is more and more people want the pangolin, more and more people can afford the pangolin, so it's being decimated. Nobody knows how many pangolins survive in the wild today, but at least 1 million have been trafficked over the last decade, making them the most trafficked mammal in the world.
So I'm still a little puzzled here. So I'll leave the pronunciation to you, and I thank you for that. I'm one of these people who reads things and never hears them said out
Oh, no,
loud.
that's me too, don't worry.
But is this just like a local thing? So is this part of a larger network?
So the biggest demand for pangolins are in Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam and China. But as the conservationists like to say, China has already hoovered up pretty much all of its pangolins. I mean, if you talk to older folks in these parts of the world, they'll say, oh yeah, I used to see like pangolins crossing the street when I was a kid, and now you never see that anymore. And you can follow that trend by looking at the trade data. So I'm really bad with dates, but maybe like 7 to 10 years ago, pangolin seizures suddenly started occurring from Africa to Asia. So as Asia depletes its pangolins, it's turning to Africa for a new source.
So I wonder, Tim, you're working in 13 or so countries, I think. Rachel just kind of alluded to this. There seems to be sort of like a relatively recent spike in wildlife trafficking. I mean, why has it grown in recent years?
Well, it's all about demand. The demand has increased, and there are lots of different theories about why the demand has increased. I think Rachel touched on certainly one of them, where as the world's economy grows and there are more people with more affluence, they have a desire to purchase things that otherwise they couldn't get their hands on. And there are status symbols associated with it, there are medicinal properties associated with it, and much of this is driven by an increase in the economies in Asia. And as pointed out with the pangolin, it's a great example because Asia is turning to Africa to fulfill its needs for wildlife species because so many of them have been depleted in Asia already.
So, Rachel, you went to, what, 10 countries? 12?
12, but
12.
I wrote too much, so I had to cut a couple chapters.
So you went to 12 countries, but you wrote about 10.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a lot of on-the-ground putting. I'm wondering, who are the customers here?
There are all sorts of customers. It's from the grandmother in Vietnam who wants to always have a little bit of rhino horn on hand so that when her grandchild gets sick, she can break his fever by giving him some of this elixir. It's the rich kind of douchebag guy who wants to show off to his friends by bringing his horn out, and then after a night of drinking, he's like, here, have some of this horn. You won't have a hangover tomorrow. It's people who are hoarding things like rhino horn and ivory in the hopes of prospecting them, that they will gain in value and then they can make a killing once these species go extinct. It's people who just find these things beautiful. I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever seen ivory, but it's gorgeous when carved. I mean, it's beautiful jewelry. And there's also a special type of collector in China, and this is a person who wants to get in touch with their history, with their tradition. They're searching for like the China of yore. And to do that, they're collecting antiques, they're studying kung fu, they're buying rhino horn. It's all types of people.
Well, this sounds pretty innocent.
It's a lot of people over there.
So, I mean, is this like a conservation issue, or is this really a crime? Is this a conflict of folkways?
I mean, is it a crime if everybody in this room wants a little cocaine? I mean, it's against the law, so. I mean, where do you define crime? I mean, it's hurting these species. If we all continue to want a little bit of this and that, the animals will go extinct. There's a reason, there's a law in place saying these things are illegal.
So then, who's doing the trafficking? These are not small-scale operations.
Right. I mean, it's everything from organized cartels with a hierarchy, with a boss, like the Pablo Escobar thing, to someone smuggling something back in their luggage after they take a vacation in Mozambique, for example. From a one-off to highly organized criminal gangs.
So I'm curious to back up for a second. So I'm wondering how you got to this juncture. You were not a journalist, and you were working on a degree in conservation ecology. Actually, in a way, when we'll talk to Tim about this in a minute, you two actually have something sort of in common here. But so, what made you give up a perfectly respectable career in science to become a scruffy journalist?
So, like many people in this room, I'm sure, I wanted to be a scientist. I got midway through my graduate degree and realized I was really an awful scientist. I hated R programming, I hated statistics, I was asking everybody for help, I was getting bored in my classes, and a stream ecology professor mentioned these like magical people called science journalists who translate scientific findings into stories, and then he kind of said something like, oh, but that's not us, that's for those liberal arts people. And I was like, oh my God, he's talking to me. So I went home and I Googled what is science journalism, because I never heard of it, and I found SHRP, and I was like, that's it, I've got to switch. But yeah, I love nature, I love the outdoors, and I just felt like this is the best way I could serve my passion while also actually being good at my job.
So you actually come to this as something of an activist. I mean, you come to this broadly with an interest and a passion for this topic.
Yes, I have an interest in saving animals, but not radically so. I know there's a few vegetarians in the room, but I understand that people will always use wildlife. People make money off wildlife. It's unrealistic to just say we cannot use animals at all. So it's finding the balance there.
So Tim, you started out in conservation biology, environmental conservation biology, I think, at the University of New Hampshire. Something changed your mind? Something an advisor said? What?
Yeah, I started off similarly. I thought I enjoyed the outdoors. It was in my undergraduate degree. I wanted to learn about environmental conservation. I wasn't really sure what direction I was going to go. And I had a major professor who had devoted his life to pretty much studying white-tailed deer and studying ptarmigan in Canada, and he had fantastic slides and great stories about being in the wilderness, and it was like, oh, it sounded all romantic. But he told everybody in the program but there really are no jobs here. And your likelihood of being able to become a scientist and be successful is really quite small. And this was many years ago, in the early 80s, and he basically said there's a huge gap between science and how the general public understands science. And there's a need, an urgent need, to have more people that understand science but can translate it to the general public, because that's truly what's missing and that's truly what's needed. And I thought, okay, I'm not really convinced I can stand apart as a scientist. I didn't know what I was really going to do, and I thought, that looks good for me. And so I started down that path, a sort of a mixture of science and journalism path, but I got pulled aside because before I graduated, I just wanted to do a little bit of studying overseas, and I took a trip and spent a semester in Kenya. And I went for 3 months, and it was 3 years before I came back. And that got me hooked, sort of, on Africa. And here I am a few decades later.
Yeah, so the two of you share a passion for communicating science, for writing about science, for shaping public perceptions of a particular field, and I guess a well-stamped passports. So I want to go back for a sec now, because I'm still trying to think about something here. You talked about the people and the things that they use some of these for, and you talked with some, kind of affection for ivory, carved ivory. Do you own any ivory?
No.
No? No?
No. Good question, but no.
Never know. You never know. We could have a little bonfire right here.
We could stomp on it.
But seriously though, so you make it clear in your book that this is an industry driven by and large, not so much by, like, say, trophy hunting, which I guess is what a lot of us think about these days, because we see the pictures of various public figures with their trophies. But in animal-based traditional health and wellness treatments. These have been pretty consistently debunked, though, haven't they? Why does it persist then?
They have, for the things that are traditional, because there is so much of this like newfangled use that is driving this. But for the things that are traditional, much of it has been debunked as best it can. The exception would be bear bile, but that's a whole other thing. The problem is when you think about trying to change someone's mind about their grandbaby being treated with this rhino horn, it's almost like trying to think about trying to convince a believer that there is no God. There's no amount of logic or reason or argument or science you can throw at them to make them give up this faith-based belief, because that's really what it is. It's something that they've been taught since they were a child. It's something they are completely surrounded with, and they don't care if your scientific study shows there's no significance in these lab rats or whatever. It's not going to be effective.
And remember, the placebo effect is real.
And that, yes. Thank you.
The placebo effect, isn't that like one of those little furry things you find in South America? If their teeth are very valuable, no? So this is great for us to say, but so how are these people supposed to know that? Or do they even care?
I don't think they care. They don't care what we think. And yeah, it's probably working to some degree anyway. I mean, if you are believing this so strongly, you could break your own fever.
So where would I find this? I looked on eBay today. I actually looked for a good price on tiger's teeth. I couldn't find any. I looked for elephant skin. I couldn't find any.
You're probably not using the right search words.
Maybe we should talk afterwards.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, so if I'm a consumer, and one of the things that I think that you do in the book that's so interesting is that you go into the field, you spend a lot of time actually seeking out the people who use this stuff, who in some cases are now in jail for trafficking it. But I'm just kind of wondering, as a journalist, as a reporter, I mean, how did you sort of prepare yourself for this, and how did you carry it out? Like, what was the squirreliest situation you put yourself in?
I mean, I approached all my subjects as I would anyone, with as open mind as possible, no matter what I think, and just, hey, like, tell me what you're using. Why are you doing this? Why do you think this? And to be honest, none of these people struck me as particularly scary, because a lot of people don't think they're doing anything wrong, and like, the police aren't going to come after you. I mean, I had a rhino horn user bring his rhino horn to a crowded restaurant in Hanoi and start demonstrating it to me at the table while people were around us and the waitress is coming over. I mean, people just do not care, which is part of the problem.
Do you see your role here and with this book to make those people care? I mean, do you think
this book is not going to reach those people,
right,
but
yeah.
I hope it reaches people who make decisions, people who make donations to conservation organizations, people who can tell their friends on Facebook, like, hey, don't like that tickling, whatever, what is it, the Madagascar lemur? No.
Yeah.
Is it? Loris, thank you.
I beg your pardon, would you say that loud?
Thank you.
Slow
Thank you.
Loris. That does sound like a Dr. Seuss character, doesn't it?
It does. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to change minds that didn't know they needed to be changed because they didn't know about this. There's nothing I can really do or say to get the people using these things, most of them, to change their mind. I mean, I literally asked that rhino horn guy in Hanoi, would you care if rhinos go extinct? And he's like, no, not really. Although at the end of the conversation, he said something strange to me. He's like, you know, like, I've met you and you care, so like, if you care enough, maybe I would stop. I don't think he stopped, but.
So the audience then is us, the people in this room.
It's us, but it's the us of the world. It's not just us, New York liberals in the U.S. I hope that everyone will read this. I hope that young people in Vietnam will read it, in China, in Kenya, wherever.
Tim, I want to kind of ask you a question kind of from your side of the fence. WCS has a very, it's a huge organization. It's active in very many countries, but it does have a kind of an overarching strategy of trying to work with governments to affect change in these areas. You're not the most outspoken group in the world. So is it your thought that maybe publicity is not the best strategy for change?
No. I think that publicity is important, but it comes in many different shapes and sizes. And I think you're alluding to our approach in WCS, where we need to work in, and we do work in conjunction with governments. They're our primary partner in all of the countries where we work. And the way to publicize and communicate from our perspective is to work within government. And that's a different kind of communication, a different kind of publication, as opposed to those that stand on the outside and want to criticize from the outside to raise awareness and to have shock value, or to demonstrate rage, and another way to raise awareness. And there are many different forms of communication, and each of them have different impacts. But for us, with our primary objective, is to work alongside governments so that we can help improve conservation in the countries where we work, which is really it's a combination of a sprint and a marathon. You have to work on the key issues urgently, but you also have to realize that we're in it for the long haul. We're in it to make change over time, so that ultimately, years down the road, it's okay to be waiting to have progress in some cases.
I'm still kind of, working within, for effective change and working with governments, that sounds great, and so don't misunderstand me, but you're also, in some cases, talking about very corrupt systems. You're talking about violent attacks in national parks, and how can you just stay quiet? And how do you affect change with a government you can't trust?
I didn't say the governments that we couldn't trust, right? And I said we work in close partnership with them. And one of the things that I find people do often ask me, and they say, oh, you work in Africa, and Africa is so corrupt. How can you do that? And I think we tend to not look introspectively and say, do you really think that there's no corruption here in the United States? Do we not have a corrupt government here? Are there not evidence of that? Look at New York State, the history of New York State. It's riddled with corruption. So I think we need to be honest and reflective when we say, what is the level to which we're willing to tolerate? And there are times when you say, no, we can't tolerate a certain whatever level it is. But what is important is to recognize that in any government, there are good people, and in any government, there are corrupt people. And our challenge is to make sure we find the people that share our values and share our goals and work with them and
Can you
try
give me
to.
an example?
Yeah, I spent a number of years working in Tanzania, and I worked in Serengeti National Park, and I have learned and become fairly close friends with the Chief Park Warden of Serengeti National Park.
Okay.
And there's no question in my mind that he is his name is William Wakilema, and he's a very committed conservationist who's devoted his life to working on conserving Tanzania's natural resources. There are issues within Tanzania's government, the same that there are issues within our government, and he has to work the paths that he can work. And I could go through pretty much other countries, every country where we work, there are people like that within the governments that we find and we work closely with to try to affect change.
So, Rachel, you're listening to this,
I am.
and does it, and I mean this not with no disrespect, but you, of course, if you're committed to working inside for change, you're also committed to being tactful when you're outside. Does his description of this process jibe with what you encountered as a journalist on the ground there, say?
I mean, with WCS for sure. I mean, there's a lot of times I'll talk to sources, not really you, but some sources at WCS, and they'll say, okay, well, here's the real deal, and you can't say that in your New York Times story, and here's my quote, because they are very conscientious about how they come across, and if they say the wrong thing, they're going to get kicked out of the country, and then they're never going to be able to work there again, and that's not good for anybody.
Do you have a sense of burning bridges when you don't settle for the nice
I really try not
tactful
to
quote?
burn the bridges. I mean, if they're talking to me off the record, I respect that.
Oh, yeah, no, I didn't
for
mean
sure.
it that way, but
Yeah.
I mean as a function of your own
I don't-
independent
I
reporting.
mean, I've definitely had sources say like, oh, well, here's like the nice message you should deliver in your story to kind of like push this government toward positive change rather than call them out for the BS.
Can you give me an example?
Well, this Japan story just had come out. Yesterday I had a big story come out in National Geographic about ivory trade in Japan, and I met with some people from the US Embassy, all completely off the record, and they were kind of like, oh, well, the thing you have to do with Japan is to like let this be their idea and say how great they're doing and all, and I'm just, no, that's not why I'm here. So yeah, if there's BS, I'm gonna call it out, but I'm not gonna burn my source, and I'm gonna respect their position in the country as well.
So then, how did you get the other side? How did you get behind the tactful blandishments and pleasantries?
Oh, well, I didn't quote the embassy people at all. I just talked to the people who are working on the conservation side of it, working in universities. There's plenty of people who can say the same thing.
So you really, in your reporting and in the book, you really kind of go through this menu of parts and endangered species that are being trafficked. And I'm curious, what for you was most surprising? You talked about the one that you liked the most. I mean, is it the...
I hate to say this, but the most surprising thing to me was the lack of cohesive coordination between the people all fighting toward ending this problem. There's just like a lot of trash talking behind the scenes and competition and pettiness and jealousy that I heard about, and you know, everybody is on the same side, and I just feel like if we could all work together, we could make it a lot further, which is a point I touch on in this New York Times excerpt today.
There are, you know, a reasonable effort to try and control the illegal traffic with varying degrees of effectiveness. As you both have suggested, there's international sanctions. Even China has passed a law against some of these things. But, you know, some countries have taken the attitude that, or taken the stance, well, the way to really control this is to, the illegal traffic is to create a legal traffic. serve the market. South Africa, you talk about. I wonder if you'd bring us into that a little bit.
Yes. So in South Africa, people can privately own wildlife, and a lot of people own rhinos. South Africa is home to the majority of the world's rhinos. The problem is rhinos are under siege right now. As Tim once put it to me, it's like they're walking around with a bar of gold on their face. It's just very difficult to protect them if everybody wants to get them. And some rhino owners want to sustainably harvest their rhino's horns because it's like a fingernail. You can just clip it off and it grows back in a few years. So they want to do this and sell it and use that money, not necessarily to flood the market and satisfy demand because there's not enough rhinos left on the planet to satisfy demand, but to use that money to pay for protection so that their rhinos won't stop getting slaughtered. I completely get that argument. I just don't know that it's going to work, and it gets into all kinds of gnarly ethics. You can keep asking questions.
Gnarly ethics?
Gnarly, gnarly.
But they're also raising lions. They're also raising lions, for instance.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In some quantity, both for trophy hunting legally, I think.
Yes.
But also for, I guess they use lion bones and as substitute for tiger bones.
It's legal to export lion bones to Asia as long as you have the right permits, and they're probably passed off there as tiger bones, which people say, okay, that might drive demand for tigers, or it might satisfy demand for tigers and protect tigers, but people really don't have the answers to these questions. No one can say for sure what effect that has on the market.
Well, I was quite struck. One of the very powerful parts of your book, you're writing about how in South Africa, which is, let's just say, is making a good faith effort to sort of create a legal market-based solution. I'm from the Wall Street Journal, so I talk about things this way.
Nice.
Legal market-based solution to this trafficking. Hey, there are people who want it. Mm-hmm. Why don't we raise the particular endangered wildlife under humane conditions as we would a sheep
the government
or
isn't
an
on
Angus
board
bull.
with that, by the way.
Well, I think the Environment Ministry is, or was.
They don't want to
I
sell
certainly don't want to
rhino
argue
horn,
with
but
you.
yeah,
You
it's
are the
cool.
authority. But what I wanted to raise was this idea that they've created kind of a legal rhino hunting loophole, and where there are these pseudo hunting rings, and that you actually encountered one of these people in prison. I wonder if you'd just tell us a little bit about this. One, how you prepared yourself for this encounter, but two, how you got onto this very strange smuggling racket. I don't know what else to call it.
Well, pseudo hunting took place about 10 years ago now, and it was one of the first sort of inklings that rhino horn demand was beginning to ignite in Asia. And in South Africa, where else? Namibia, Zimbabwe? No, not Zimbabwe. Rhino hunting.
Yeah, I think it was just further south.
Okay, you can legally kill a rhino with the right permits, and you pay thousands of dollars to do it, and the profits are supposed to be reinvested in conservation. Whether or not that happens is a totally different question. But some really enterprising criminals from Asia caught on to this and decided to exploit this legal route. So the thing is, you can only hunt one rhino per year. So this one guy, Chumlong Limtung Tai, began to recruit prostitutes to hunt rhinos. And that way he could get the horns legally by getting a permit. He could send them back to Thailand and Vietnam and make a killing. Chumlong got caught after ordering the killing of 50 rhinos, all legal, and got put away in prison. Well, I really wanted to interview a so-called kingpin for my book, and none of the kingpins I was trying to friend on Facebook were answering my Facebook requests.
I'm sorry, I want to back up for a second. This is
Sure.
as a reporting technique. I think some of us would like to know about the process by which you friend a kingpin. How does that work? Is that
it's
that
the
like
same way,
is
like,
that
I
in
would
their
friend
no? But I
you
mean,
if
is
I was
that
gonna friend you.
in their little status line? You know,
Oh, well,
I'm single. I'm a kingpin. How did you identify these people,
Well,
is
like,
what I'm getting
their
at?
faces are on the news, and
Uh-huh.
like Chumlong's profile had him with like a gun doing that with like ivory, so
Yeah.
they're not hiding it.
They're not hiding, yeah?
So yeah, I sent some friend requests, nobody responded, it's really sad. But I knew Chumlong was in prison, so I'm like, I know where you are, like maybe you'll talk to me. But I kept like calling the prison, and I couldn't really figure out how to set up an appointment, so I decided to just show up. It's in Pretoria. So I showed up, and it's like this really sad building, like one of the like sadder places where you would go and like try out for your driver's test or something. And I filled out some paperwork, and it was like, how do you know this person? I was like, friend. So
With a little emoji, right? Yeah.
yeah, heart. And I finally got in. There was some like shady questioning, and he just talked to me. I think he was really lonely.
How long had he been in prison at that point?
4.5 years or so, and
Mhm.
he said nobody visited him. I was the only guest he had for a long time. So, yeah, it got emotional.
Uh-huh. And what insight did you walk away with from having met the kingpin?
The most interesting thing I found out there is everybody thought that this guy Chumlong was gonna have like this huge payday when he got out of jail, that his boss back in Laos was gonna take care of him and his family, But he was very, very, very insistent that as soon as he got put away, everybody abandoned him. Like, his friends did not have his back at all, which I thought was very interesting.
But didn't he recently get out of jail?
He did.
Like
Surprise.
27 years early? Or something?
Well,
I mean,
his sentence got reduced to 13, but in
Okay.
South Africa, if you are good, they'll let you out usually at the halfway point. So he served 6.5 years. Yeah, I got an email like a week ago from a friend in South Africa, and Chumlong was put on a plane, and he's back in Thailand now.
but you're still in touch on Facebook?
I actually sent him a new Facebook request, which I'm waiting on. Did. Yeah, I think he's probably busy.
Well, I hope he's got some catching up to do, I expect.
Exactly.
So I want to switch over to you for a moment, Tim, because you've kind of given this, I think, nice picture of how the Wildlife Conservation Society approaches this subject, kind of on the QT, you know, in sneakers, you know, quietly working. You forgive me, I'm giving you a hard time, but
That's all right.
I came across something that you wrote that I was quite intrigued about, that I was interested in your thoughts on. A number of groups, not WCS, but in recent years have staged, in order to attract attention to, in this case, elephant poaching, elephant and rhino poaching, staged these quite public burnings of valuable ivory. In fact, I think we did one in Central Park about 18 months ago, small one. But you went to one, or were present at one in Kenya, where there were like 100 tons of elephant ivory,
107.
representing something like
That was big.
Yeah. A lot.
8,000 some poached elephants. Could you, one, tell me about that experience, and then secondly, is this an effective tactic? Does this work? Because I know a number of governments have staged these things in the time since, and I'm just curious about your assessment of this as a communications attention-getting device.
Well, there's no doubt when it was first done in Kenya, it galvanized the world's attention.
What year was that?
Why don't you tell us?
1989?
I think it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so,
thank you.
thank you. Somebody has the data. I wasn't there at that time, but it had a significant role in playing, raising attention around the world for this issue about poaching of elephants and the value of ivory. Since then, of course, it's happened repeatedly, and I think that in some ways it's the sort of return on that, you know, media bump gets less every time it happens. However, the purpose behind it is to put ivory out of commercial use. And there are a few ways that that can happen. but it's the choice of the government. If it's deciding it's going to do this, in what way will it do it? And Kenya has continued to do it in a way to help not just raise awareness around the world, but also bring other countries in support of this idea that there really ivory shouldn't be available for commercial use anymore. And I think that concept of how do you take ivory out of the market is a very important one. And that's, in general, a fundamental difference in the way that the Eastern African countries view ivory and how it should be related to the market, and Southern African countries, which are much more utilitarian, where they're managing their populations, and they essentially have a renewable resource. And it's a true conflict, and it's right at the heart of a true dilemma for conservation of elephants. But at the moment, it's very clear. When it comes to the market, it's not possible to determine the difference between a legally produced piece of ivory and an illegally produced piece of ivory. And as that continues to be the case, then I believe it's just we should not have ivory that's allowed to be legally traded, because essentially it creates the opportunity for more illegal trade. And that is symbolized by the burning of ivory. Personally, I feel as if there's probably a better way. Before the ivory burn, when I was looking at the piles of ivory, and you just couldn't help but be awestruck by how much ivory was there and how many animals this represented, and everything from little tusks from baby elephants to massive mammoth tusks. And you looked at it, and it's an awe-inspiring feeling. And when you touch ivory, it has such a solid, dense feeling to it that it evokes an emotional response. And I would like to see more people be able to have that experience. And I think that we should be trying to use the ivory that's been captured and put in a way, in some cases, as Rachel points out in her book, there are a few places where ivory has been used in some sort of monument so that people can go see it and feel it and touch it. I personally would like to see more something like that happen in some places, just so more people, more everyday people can get a sense of what this stuff really is.
Professor Fagan, you have a question.
Yes, I thought I would start the questioning and encourage others to come up behind me. So you're in a room full of journalists and aspiring journalists. So I guess it would be great to hear both of you, from your differing perspectives, talk about, give us some specific examples of what journalists are doing wrong in covering this issue. And clearly one of them is this obsession with kingpins, with the people at the top. Of course, kingpins are more interesting, but the problem, as the excerpt published in the Times today from Rachel's book shows, going after the kingpins is not a complete solution. So, do you both agree with that? Tim, do you agree that this sort of obsession with the media and law enforcement on going after the big guys is inadequate? And then beyond that, what else do you see in the media coverage that you think is wrong or could be improved?
Great question. Why don't we start you, Rachel, and then Tim. Kingpins, good or bad? I mean, useful, not useful, misleading. You arrest one and another takes the place. The real problem is the network. I mean, how do you?
It's definitely a game of whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole. Okay.
That's not my phrase. That's
so another endangered species.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kingpins are part of the problem. Just to answer the question more broadly, which I think also relates to kingpins and the regurgitation of the kingpin line, is just the depth of coverage isn't usually there, and I mean rightfully so. Not everyone can fly to Malawi and spend a week there, like figuring out what's actually going on. I've been a journalist who did aggregation posting or had to write like 12 stories a week. Time is of essence, and you get a nice press release that says, say, like drones stop poachers or kingpin arrested, ivory is solved, and you just report that and, or not report it, repeat it. That would be my number one pet peeve, but I don't really know what the solution is for that besides not covering wildlife trade if you don't have the resources to doing it, which I don't know if that's a solution either.
Yeah, but I want to linger for a second because you, unlike most of us, you've had the experience of sitting in prison with someone who was a kingpin. Did taking him out of circulation have an effect on
I mean, the thing about
wildlife
Chumlong is,
trafficking in his
yeah.
region? I mean, did it
No,
knock it?
no.
It didn't knock it down.
But Chumlong wasn't really a kingpin. He was just like this middle guy. He was
Okay.
getting orders from the kingpin in Laos, who has since
Okay.
retired, but the trade continues. So in that case, no, it didn't work.
So Tim, what's your view of the proper way to, what do they call it? Decapitation? Isn't that the nasty Pentagon word? Taking out the head of a network. I mean, the kingpin idea, has that been effective? I think I was just reading the other day that there were 3 senior kingpins were arrested in Kenya, I guess, in connection with some elephant network. Does that work, or is it just there are too many people involved, too many customers, too many smugglers, too many of everything for this to work? I mean, what does it look like from you? You've got 13 countries you have your fingers in.
I think the challenge with the concept of the kingpin, there are multiple challenges. One, it's not a well-defined term. And two, it leads you to believe that there's a silver bullet. If you do this, you're going to solve everything. And that's one of the challenges, is that there is no silver bullet here. When it comes to dismantling illegal trade, you have to approach it from multiple perspectives. WCS likes to think about it in 3 simple terms about you have to stop the killing, stop the trafficking, and stop the demand. And I think it's a useful structure to think about the issue. If we focus in on the trafficking is not just a single person or two. There are distributed networks, and our approach is more about trying to disrupt and dismantle the networks. And if you try to understand the complexity of that, then you realize, yes, removing key individuals that help destabilize a network is a necessary strategy. But that in and of itself does not ultimately result in directly the reduction in poaching. But if you're working on all aspects of the trade, then I think it definitely does have an impact. And I think a way to think about this is that illegal activities, in order for them to persist, for them to be profitable businesses, given that you're from the Wall Street Journal, right? For those businesses to be successful, they tend to follow the path of least resistance. And they're finding the path of least resistance to remain most profitable. One of the issues that Rachel raises quite well in her book is that many of the people in these systems feel no resistance. So they are able to follow whatever path they want. If you think about it in the context of taking down kingpins or dismantling, I would prefer that we think about trying to disrupt these networks. That's creating more friction. It's creating more of a pushback. And the more we can do that, the more that we stand a chance of being able to actually disrupt these networks and move them either out of where we don't want them to be, or better yet, move them out of wildlife altogether onto something else.
Sir, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not a hopeful person, but I'm wondering if in your reporting, Rachel, you found anything that gave you reason for hope for a trafficked wildlife.
So Tim gave me so much reason for hope. I want you to share your reasons for hope.
My reasons for hope.
Yes.
I believe that when you're working in conservation, we get asked you often get asked questions about, oh, look at climate change. The world's falling apart. We have no choice. Look at, endangered species. Their, species extinctions are on the increase, and, the human race is basically not, it's going to win, and everything else is going to lose, and there's really no hope. I hear that a lot. And then I hear it also applied to Africa is corrupt, there's no hope in Africa, and it's often a very simplistic way of looking at the world, and sometimes just out of sheer survival, that's why people reach this conclusion. I believe it's necessary for us to adopt a different way of thinking, and I talked with Rachel about this, where, you have to hold on to, you have to choose an optimistic approach, but it needs to be purposeful. It's not just optimism for the sake of optimism for the sake of a blind faith in something. It's optimism that you choose purposefully with full knowledge of the challenges that you face. And I think this issue of trafficking and our kingpin's important. If you really think about how difficult it is to dismantle illegal networks, we need to look at the war on drugs in the United States and how much time and effort was spent on that. And there are plenty of ways to look at those situations and say, oh, it's a futile approach. But I believe there are plenty of examples of hope, and Rachel's book, in the second half of her book, looks to some of those specific examples where you can say, wow, somebody actually turned this around here.
Give me an example, because I'm getting very depressed, and I
Yes.
need hope.
You need
Give me
hope.
an example.
Why don't you tell
Okay,
your examples from your book?
So I
Give me
could
an
not have
example.
said that better, which is why I punted that over to you.
Mhm.
It's definitely the individuals and the examples I encounter in the field that give me hope. Zakuma National Park is my go-to example. It's in Chad. Like, what do you think of when you think Chad? Probably not like thriving national park and elephants and happiness. But there was a national park there. It was getting absolutely hammered by Janjaweed poachers coming in on horseback from Sudan with all kinds of guns and rocket launchers. The elephant population collapsed, something insane, from like 4,000 to 400 in less than 10 years. Ridiculous. Everyone said, this is done, let's give up on Zakuma. But then this awesome nonprofit organization called African Parks came in, and what they do is they rehabilitate failing national parks. They take over management from the government. It's a government partnership, but African Parks calls all the shots on the ground. And they just made it happen. They got rid of the poachers. The elephants are now growing. They're having babies again. Tourists are coming in. I came in. It was a lovely place. Everyone should visit. Go to Chad. And yeah, it was super hopeful.
I have an example as well. I just came back from Mozambique,
Mm-hmm.
where WCS works in partnership with the government of Mozambique and Nyasa National Reserve. That is a place where poaching is still very much an issue. It's has been at very high levels for a number of years. Last year in December, it sort of had reached crisis point, and there was sort of a collective plea that we needed the government to step up and do more. And there was a concern that that wouldn't happen. And then over the last 9 months, there's been a tremendous collaborative effort between the government, WCS, and multiple partners there, including other NGOs and for-profits working in the area. And it's been a phenomenal turnaround.
So what are the concrete specifics of that turnaround? I mean, more guns for park rangers, predator drones following the elephant herds to knock off the people from the city. I mean, help us understand what works.
I'd point to probably 3 key things. One of them was the agreement of everyone to work together, which included the government's willingness to bring in the police, and they have special trained rapid response units.
Mm-hmm.
But a key part of this is that it's the local governments, the provincial governments that were providing this. These are their folks. And in order for that to happen, though, you can't just plunk something in the middle of a situation. There needs to be collaboration and cooperation for people to work together. And that happened, which basically gave a much greater deterrent effect. And this deterrent effect is very important. A second issue is that we are able to raise the resources to bring in a helicopter to help in the wet season, where it's extremely difficult to get around, and this helped us take limited resources and train people and put them in the right places at the right time to be a faster response and have a greater impact. And those two factors were significant, and the challenge is being able to sustain that over time.
Is there a question in the shadows there?
Indeed. My question is really most specifically for Rachel. As Dan had mentioned, you've been working on this book for a very long time, and I'm just curious over the scope of, over that stretch of time, about the ways in which the scope or the message or the execution might have changed in your own mind. Is this the book that you imagined you would have been writing 8 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago?
That's a great question. First of all, I never imagined that I would be in the book. That made me very uncomfortable to put myself in the book, but it was just a solution to a problem I had, which was how to make everything tie together rather than just be like a bunch of disjointed chapters and stories. And as far as the scope, it's just ballooned and ballooned. When I first put together this proposal, I thought I understood what illegal wildlife trade was. I thought I got like, okay, these are the main people, check, check, check. But once I started digging into this, I realized I really knew very little about this subject, and it was going to have to be a much bigger book than I imagined, and definitely it doesn't cover everything.
You came to your calling as a science journalist with the idea for this book,
Yes,
and everybody told you it was a terrible idea.
yes, they did. Yes, they did. Well, yeah, not Dan and not John, but
Well, my question is sort of a process question for those of us who have a vast set of bad book ideas. How did you persist, and how did you manage this? There are people in the room who are trying to figure out how to do what you did.
I think I'm a bad role model because I didn't persist. I took the book proposal that we wrote in SHRP, maybe in Steve's class.
So this game was
but yeah.
actually a class project
Yes,
in part.
it
okay?
was. It was a class project, but I already was like, I have to write this book. This is why I was like born and everything. And I wrote the proposal, and then I graduated from SHRP, and I was like, okay, zero experience, ready to write the book. And I shopped it around to various agents and editors, most of whom did not respond to me, but those who did respond said this is a stupid idea. Nobody is ever going to want to read about sad animals dying, so give it up. And I thought, okay, well, if the professionals say so, the professionals must be right. I'm going to scrap that. And then a few years later, Dan's agent got back from a trip to Kenya where she discovered the illegal wildlife trade and came back, and her eyes were open, and she was like, oh my God, I found this thing, and I have to find someone to write a book about it. And Dan put us in touch, but by this time I was jaded and like, this is not gonna happen. This is gonna be a huge waste of time and money. But she was very convincing, and I thought, okay, this is one of the reasons I did journalism. I should just give this thing a shot. And so I did.
Because there was like a huge book advance, right?
Yeah,
that
because it was
covered
like so
all
much
your
money.
expenses.
Yeah, yeah.
And, yeah?
Yeah, no, it's so bad. Like, well, freelancing is fine. Like, I make a very happy living freelancing. I like it a lot. And this advance is just, like, after the agent fee and the taxes, it's maybe like what I would make in a month. And this is for a book that's going to require me to go around the world. But I don't know why, I just decided to do it.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how did you pull it off?
I emptied my bank account.
That's a
and
start.
Yes, I did empty my bank account, and that guy right there paid my rent for 6 months.
Well, hats off to you.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, it was terrifying, but it was very expensive, and I understand that not everybody has the privilege to be able to do that.
to get him to pay the rent?
Well, they could, they could ask.
Yeah, I think, no, I mean, is this not the common experience of writing a first book?
Is it or is it not?
Is it not?
Oh, this is my first book, so.
Yeah, but
yeah.
you know,
I
oh,
don't
so
know.
you didn't have a writer's group, for instance? You didn't have people you could bounce off?
I don't really talk to people.
You
other
don't
than
talk to
that.
people.
Yeah.
You're doing a good job tonight. Which actually brings something up. So, Tim, I've been wondering, now you're a source for this book. You appear in this book as a certain point. And I'm curious, from your standpoint, is she a good interviewer? I mean, did she get the story out of you, or did she, like, miss it? I mean, you can be honest.
Yeah, no, she's very unassuming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that through the unassuming approach, she finds out information.
She suckered you.
Yep.
Ah, yeah. Okay, that's a good technique. That's a good technique. So we have a question here.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi. Sorry. So you guys were, you mentioned a little bit earlier about, like you mentioned, the U.S. government has its own issues with failed war on drugs. But I'm curious if in both of your working with this issue, because most of the conversation has been about Asia and then a little bit of sourcing from Africa, but I'm curious if either of you have ever been confronted, or people, I guess when you discuss this problem, kind of throw something else back in your face of an issue that Westerners maybe participate in, or something that they don't seem to care that they are causing problems with and are oblivious to, or something like that. I mean, and maybe not, because both of you mentioned that many people don't have feelings of guilt about this, so there's no need to defend yourself if you don't feel like you're doing anything wrong. But I'm curious if there's anyone ever tries to give you like a parallel of you Westerners don't X.
I definitely.
Tim, are we complicit?
Are we complicit? Sometimes, I think. I think there can be willful ignorance.
Willful ignorance.
Yeah, I think it's possible. If you don't want to really address an issue head on, it's possible to say, I don't really want to look at it. A lot of I think wildlife trafficking, but I think the pain and suffering of animals is a very difficult thing for a lot of people to experience. And for example, willful ignorance, a key issue is a major issue in wildlife conservation in Africa is the snaring of animals. There are snares put over, almost all of the protected areas, and most of those animals are being caught by local people for food. And other animals get caught in their wake, but there's a tremendous amount of suffering that goes on as a result of that. But it's an issue that doesn't get much attention at all. And I think some of it's because it's a little bit too mundane, a little bit too gory, and not flashy enough to capture headlines. But nevertheless, it's a major contributor to the decline of wildlife in Africa today.
Rachel, what's your thought to that question?
Interesting. I might have heard the question a little bit differently, but
I'm sure you did.
I would say that we're not innocent. There's a tremendous pet industry here, for example, that sources animals that are illegally captured in the wild and then laundered into legality and sold as wild caught. People here in the U.S. do consume ivory and other wildlife products. And I've also heard the argument, usually from Westerners actually, like, oh, well, we depleted our wildlife, so why shouldn't people in Africa or Asia be allowed to deplete their wildlife to gain the wealth that we have now? I don't have a great answer, but my answer is it's global biodiversity. It belongs to everybody, and we should learn from our past mistakes.
Please.
Hi. So I have a question on your preparation step for the book. So as like a freelancer, were there any hardships while like applying for visa or finding your sources or finding a translator when reporting in a foreign country?
For sure. There were so many just kind of false leads or things that I spent days doing that led nowhere. ultimately, it was kind of just like grasping in the dark for something to work out. And luckily, I usually manage to meet someone like Tim, who could be a guiding light, or finagle my way into like a press trip to this giant ivory burn in Kenya. It was a lot of failing, but maybe out of like 5 things tried, 1 thing would work out, and that wound up being enough.
Please.
First time caller, long time listener. Yeah, I mean, since we're, we have an audience of reporters and, possibly editors, when it comes to this kind of work, there's a lot of international travel that's obviously expensive, but I know that you want to continue this, as your beat, and you don't want to do this all, you don't want to spend that much money all the time. So, could you talk about, kind of strategies that you're thinking about in order to continue this beat in a way that doesn't rely on all this money? And the second question, which Tim might also help on, is, what kinds of, new kinds of news hooks, might be thrown out there in order to, because I forget who said it, earlier on, like after the 9 for 10 ivory burn, there's this kind of decreased return on investment. So maybe what other kinds of news hooks might be saleable that might interest news organizations in order to help bring people in.
Thanks, Charles. So I'm trying to work on getting people to pay me to go places. So there's a huge conference, for example, in London coming up. If I was still writing the book, I would have just paid for myself to go. No one wanted to pay for me to go, so I'm just not going to go, which is fine. But I recently met with a New York Times Magazine reporter and discovered, surprise, I've been asking for way too little money. So I need to get better about asking editors for money and to pay me to fly places and to cover those expenses. And I'm hoping that now that the book is out and I've written a little bit more, I have enough of a track record to justify that. There's also grants. The Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting is incredible. I don't know if you've ever applied there, but they have so much money and they need to give it to you. As for news hooks, I guess now that I know a lot more about this topic than I did when I started, I can better recognize what makes for a story. So Tim, a moment ago, was talking about Mozambique. I'm like, oh, I'm going to email him about that tomorrow.
So I want to ask a related follow-up question, and then I want to throw it to Tim. So we've been talking about, really sustainable wildlife. And I want to ask you, is this sustainable journalism? You have talked about your perception that people want you to be a martyr, that people who commission stories want you to be a martyr for the environment. I wonder if you'd expand on that a little bit.
So when I first started writing as a freelancer and trying to land environmental stories, this was just my perception. I have no data on this, but I felt like places that did environmental stories paid a lot less than places that did like tech or health or like gee whiz science kind of stuff. And I just felt like they did want me to be a martyr, like, oh, we all love the planet, so you should accept like $40 for this 4,000 word story or whatever. I do feel like it's sustainable because before I took on this book project, it was sustainable, and I'm writing more and more about the things I care about, which is usually environmental things, and it's working so far.
That's all we can ask, one day at a time, as they
Exactly.
say. So Tim, 3 great uncovered stories.
Tell me.
Wow.
Well, one even, What's the one that everybody misses who parachutes into your backyard there on the continent?
You go through the news cycle and you watch network news, for example, and you watch one episode, and if you go through the whole week, they usually wait for Friday evening last story. They give you a feel-good story. And it's after all of the other crap that you've heard and all the other depressing news that somehow we all seem to thrive on. But I do think there are a number of stories that are that human interest story where there are people, real people in real places doing amazing things. And I do think that gets missed all the time. And sometimes you hear it, it's the ranger on patrol, or it's, I don't know, it's some other story. But I think there are a lot of these situations where you hear of people that really have devoted their life in places that you'll be surprised that they did. I worked in a place once where a poacher was caught 3 times, same person, until he finally became a ranger. And you know, it's a very interesting story about how did that person get caught, and what was the dialogue that went on, and actually that story is one that personally motivates me, because whenever I read a journalist write, or we like to turn and we like to vilify or demonize the poacher, I always have a hard time with that, because the poacher is actually there because of an economic choice. It's to have a job. And I think there's that human interest side where, if you work in environmental interpretation, there are certain tools and tips that they give you that are, you know, help you to communicate with your audience. But a key one is to connect to people's everyday life, so that they can understand the story. And I think that's what's missing. I think we have a lot of humanity going on in the conservation world that will connect directly to people, because you can relate, yeah, that person is essentially struggling the same way I am. And I can respect that, and I can support that. But that's a very different approach than the, what is the latest gee whiz, you know, banner winning, you know, headline news that's going to win you, a higher ranking on Google.
Oh, I don't know. I think the story idea that you just tossed out about the poacher, the fox who's put in charge of the hen house, that's a good story, and I'm sure there are 3 people here in the audience who are going to try and sell it, so expect their calls. Sorry, you have a question.
So this is a bit farther back in the conversation thus far, but thinking about or hearing about one of the senior level kingpins was based in Laos made me think about Laos's historic role in like the heroin trade, and the Alfred McCoy history book about it. And I was wondering, the ways in which the trafficking of these species sort of overlaps with like other infrastructures in the underworld for smuggling stuff and doing random international illegal stuff.
Do you want to take this one?
Me or you?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of overlap with drugs, wildlife, timber, what else?
Ammunition.
Ammunition.
And guns.
Yeah, illegal. I feel like there's like been illegal sugar involved at some point. Am I making that up? Yeah, I mean, the routes are there. Whatever you can make a buck off of, you're going to throw more in. That's not very eloquent, but.
Yeah, there are, trade routes are an important part of economies, all economies. And those trade routes are there for good reasons. And those trade routes can move both legal and illegal things. And I think one of the challenging parts of this issue is we're never going to get rid of trade. And there is likely always going to be some component of illegal trade. And therefore, how do we address that? And it does, we certainly know, for example, along the East African coast now, there's a lot of commingling of both drugs and wildlife. And it can occur on smaller and larger scales. And that also makes it more complicated.
I mean, we talk about conflict diamonds. Are the two of you suggesting that there's the similar relationship with the wildlife trafficking, that it's both a symptom of but enabled by civil unrest?
I think there is a relationship in some places. I think that Initially, there was quite a call that said that ivory poaching was directly related to terrorism. And that call early on, I think, was criticized because the amount of evidence to demonstrate that there was a one-to-one link was difficult. But the more we look, the more we realize that these are commingled issues. And we do need to be very careful about where we source materials from and how they are related. And I think that that's one of the issues where some of the complexities of how those things play out are difficult to get to without a sort of an in-depth in-depth look at it, which is
Rachel,
sort of
you
what
were
Rachel
nodding
does.
there. What are you thinking here?
I was just agreeing about the terrorism thing. I remember when that hit news a few years ago, and it was just like, poaching pays for terrorism, but yeah, the evidence was very scant. And I still hear that, actually, even from editors and things, like, oh, well, what about the terrorism thing? And I'm like, we're not going to put that in there.
Sir.
Yeah, I'm curious to what degree the decolonialization of the world has impacted to the volume. Obviously, the traditional certain superstitions related to things like shark's fins and pangolin scales and this sort of thing maybe always have been there, but you say part of it has to do with the economics there, but also the decolonialization of the world, and also the sort of egalitarianism, that it can't be interdicted because of cultural issues. Wondering to what degree that plays a role in the explosion or the increase of this kind of trade.
You can take that one.
Rachel, your turn.
You don't want to take that one?
It's a complicated question.
Yeah, I
It's a-
don't
it's
have
a
a great
complicated
answer for
question.
that.
Yeah.
This stuff in Asia, at least, which is where I know more about Asia than Africa, it's always been there, the demand for these things for thousands of years in China, for example. As for how colonialization has affected that, that's not something I looked into. So, yeah.
I'm going to give you the privilege of the last question.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Rachel and Mr. Tier. I believe you mentioned that your purpose of writing this book is to help people get to know about pangolin and to protect them. And also, I think Mr. Tier talked about the ivory trade. However, unlike ivory trade, only banned recently, like in China, like the pangolin trade has been long banned in those Asian countries, like tens of years ago. And also, I believe it's hard to protect pangolin by only donation. Besides, actually, I think ivory trade is still existing, also illegal. So have you ever thought about more things beyond legislation and or donation to try to make more progress about protecting those animals? For example, have you considered promote these things in Asian education? Or have you ever considered translating your book into Chinese, Vietnamese, or others to let more Asian people get to know about the fact? Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I would love for this book to be translated into Chinese. That would be great.
I share your hope for that, yes.
Yeah.
To see it is translated in as many languages as possible.
Yes, and there are people working in Vietnam, in China, in other countries where demand is to educate children about this. That's a great hope. But one of the problems is we don't have time for all those kids to grow up and take over the world to save things like pangolins. Probably a lot of these species will be gone by the time those kids take over. So demand change is very important.
And I have another point on this that I think is very hopeful, and it has something to do with, one of the benefits of social media and the rise of social media has been the communication, the global communication about how people are perceived around the world. And it's very true that in Asian countries, the concern over their face and being concerned to how they are being perceived elsewhere in the world. And it is driving the way we are addressing these issues, and trade in particular. And the example I'll give is WCS is working both in Asia and in Africa, and we have a couple programs where we are directly linking up countries in Asia with countries in Africa. And one in particular is the relationship between Vietnam and Mozambique. And both Vietnam and Mozambique are agreeing to work together because neither country is happy about the way they are perceived around the globe for how they are addressing the issues of the rhino trade. And that is driving the two countries to work together. And I feel like that is a phenomenal story because that's where the hope lies. And it lies there because the world is waking up to the fact that this isn't a great thing, this rhino horn trade. And if you really don't like it, then what can you do about it? And it does require enough of an outcry for politicians to feel like it's impacting them and that the constituency's voice is enough to merit doing something about it. And those things take time. But I think that raising awareness about this issue and raising awareness about it in multiple disciplines, so it's both, not just social media, but also in-depth looks where you can get a better understanding of the complexities of these issues, I think that that's where the future is. And the future is through greater awareness and greater understanding that we make better decisions. And I think that's a hope for society.
So I want to conclude by asking you a question. Now, but just by this strange coincidence, you are a Sherp, and I'm very curious to know what worried you the most when you started here, and what is the valuable thing that you came away with?
I was most worried by the loan situation and my ability to pay it off once I graduated. I think a lot of people can share that. Current Sherps, it's going to be okay. You will pay off your loans. I promise you that. I am loan free. It's awesome. And the most valuable thing is sitting here now. I mean, I could not be here without Sherp. I'm not paid to say that, unfortunately. I mean, this book would not have come about without Sherp. Like, I'm not a go-getter in terms of like calling people up and being like, how do I become a journalist? It gave me the tools I needed to do my job and find my calling, and I'm very happy I did it. Thanks, Dan.
Yes, and we're happy that it resulted in this. Maybe it's going to make the world a little better.
Hope so.
Tim, we thank you for the long-range work that you've been doing behind the scenes, and both of you for being here and sharing this with us tonight. It's a great way to start our fall. Thank you all very, very much.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm crying at this point.